Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Construct Innovate webinar series on innovation entrepreneurship. My name is Jamie Goggins, and I'm co-director of Construct Innovate. So, Construct Innovate is Ireland's National Research Centre for Construction, Technology and Innovation. We have over 115 different companies that are members of Construct Innovate, as well as most of the universities across the country of Ireland that are involved in the construction research within the construction sector. So, what we do is we bring together companies, industry, and academia together to try and solve some of the problems within the construction sector, or see if we can take advantage of some opportunities there. So this webinar series is a 5-part webinar series all around innovation entrepreneurship. In there, this week the focus is on inspiring stories from leading entrepreneurs. Delighted to have 3 speakers. So as I said, it's a 5-part webinar series. In there, the following week will be on software support and innovation. Then innovation from the policy perspective. Week 4 is research to market, and week 5 is breaking the silos. So the way that we do the webinar series, we have 3 speakers each week who have experience in the area, and we have the 3 presentations or 3 talks from those 3 speakers, followed by a Q&A session at the end. The talks from our 3 speakers are available on the YouTube, on the Construct Innovate YouTube channel afterwards, whereas the Q&A session is not recorded, not made available afterwards. So with that, I'm going to introduce our 3 speakers. Delighted to have fantastic speakers, lots of experience in this area in there. So our first speaker is going to be Professor John Breslin, who's Professor in Electronic Engineering at the University of Galway. He's co-founder of PorterShed. He's also have founded other things such as boards.ie. Previously, and he's going to talk about the evolution of innovation-driven enterprises, AI, climate, and energy. Then we've got Wayne Byrne, who's Water and Climate Tech Board Chair and Founder Director of Method Capital Limited. He supports water and climate technology companies to scale from pilot to commercial adaptation, supporting funders of boards through capital raising, governance, and so on in there. So he's going to walk us through how we go from idea to exits. And then we have Robbie Cousins, who's the editor of the Irish Construction News and Building Services Engineering. And one thing having great idea and so on, but how do we get that idea out there? How do we get people to take notice of our idea or innovation? How do we help build that business? So he's going to give us a talk and some guidance on how to do a perfect pitch. So in other words, the do's and don'ts of press releases. So today we'll have our 3 presenters, and after our 3 presentations, we'll move into the Q&A session afterwards. If you have any questions for any of our 3 presenters, please do pose them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And as I said, we'll deal with all those at the very end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first presenter, so over to Professor John Breslin, Professor in Electronic Engineering at the University of Galway and co-founder of the PorterShed, who's going to talk about the evolution of innovation-driven enterprises, AI, climate, and energy. So over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Jamie, and hi everyone. So delighted to be here this afternoon. I was about to say this morning, but I realized we've gone past 12 o'clock. So it's good to talk to you, and thanks to Construct Innovate and to Jamie and Cassia for the invite for today's session. So I'm John Breslin, as Jamie mentioned, and I am in the School of Engineering in the University of Galway. But I'm a big fan of startups, having, as Jamie mentioned, being involved in the startup boards.ie, which is a discussion forum website. And it was actually 20 years ago next month that I would have helped set up a spin-out company called adverts.ie, which is a classified ads website, which some of you may have used for buying and selling stuff. But I suppose in my day job, I teach a entrepreneurship program, which is called Ag Innovate, which is essentially looking at innovation in the agriculture, community and rural space. So I'm very interested in kind of methods and structures for helping other people become entrepreneurial based on some of the good things and bad things that I've done in my past, but also on trusted methodologies, which I'll be talking a little bit about today. I do research with the National Insight AI Centre, and also involved in another related initiative, which is called Data to Sustain, which is a European Digital Innovation Hub on data and AI. So let me talk a little bit about some types of companies. And I don't know if you've seen this picture before, but it's a nice starter for today's talk, because it's on this idea that there are different types of companies, and there isn't a wrong and a right here, but rather just a little bit about the characteristics of companies that we typically would encounter. And the one on the left is, I suppose, more typical of what you would think of in terms of a tech, startup or a tech scale up. Maybe an AI company would be something that we call an IDE, which is what my talk is about today. It stands for Innovation Driven Enterprise. And the innovation driven enterprise typically raises some capital at the beginning, and it, is negative in terms of money coming in, cash flow, and in balance because they have such high costs at the very beginning trying to develop that innovation, trying to get foothold in the market. And that's kind of this negative area here at the beginning. But at some point in time, they start to break even and then they go exponential. And you can compare that with the more typical SME, which we have, many companies in Ireland would be classified as SMEs. And not always, but in general, they tend to have more linear growth. They start from zero in terms of obviously revenue and cash flow and so on, but they incrementally grow over time. So, innovation-driven enterprises, because of this investment in capital that's required at the beginning, typically would be considered to be more risky, whereas SMEs are, they obviously have their own challenges, but they are usually not as risky as an innovation-driven enterprise. So that's the first little picture I wanted to show you. So for about nearly 10 years now, I've been using a methodology from MIT called disciplined entrepreneurship. So we have this concept of entrepreneurs and startups as being, that it's kind of like an almost innate ability that some people have, and that you're either entrepreneur or you're not, that you have this kind of risky nature or you're kind of mercurial individual. But in fact, I am strongly of the opinion that a lot of the things that you need to be a successful entrepreneur can actually be taught. And through programs like Construct Innovate and Ag Innovate and others, we are essentially giving people the skills to be able to work through the startup process. So this picture here is essentially some of the steps involved in helping to develop a business plan. So you kind of go in with your either your technology or your idea, or maybe it's some kind of hybrid of both, and you say to yourself, okay, I have this idea or I have this technology. Well, what's the market? Where do I start off in? And to do that, you really have to have a great understanding of who the customer is and trying to develop a fully fledged picture of who they are, what's important to them, what's their priorities, and how you align your idea or your technology to those priorities. And then it goes through a number of other steps. You can see there's 24 steps here, and the process is often referred to as 24 steps. But it goes through who's your customer, what can you do for them, how do you acquire them, and so on and so on. So that's kind of a starting point. And this gives us the foundations for developing a business plan for any type of enterprise. It could be for an SME, it could be for a social enterprise, it could be for a technology enterprise, but it is very much suited towards the innovation-driven enterprise that has some kind of innovation at its core and is using that to get traction in a particular market. Now, of course, we know that AI is everywhere. AI has really had a huge impact on how quickly and how much capital you need to spend in terms of getting a company going. So I've got a couple of curves here, and in fact, the next couple of slides are showing, related curves. We have the SME, you can see there in terms of that kind of more linear growth. As I say, it's not always that way, but it's just a typical representation of what's involved there. And you can think of a kind of a cafe in terms of employing a certain number of employees, servicing a local market, probably not export driven, but it's fulfilling a very important function in terms of what it does. An innovation driven enterprise, then you can think of something maybe like Shopify, where you are creating an offering that can really scale up and be rolled out to multiple customers as you grow and grow. But as I said, in parallel, we have the evolution of the AI impact on both types of companies, actually, both on innovation-driven enterprises and also on SMEs. And a good example of an AIDE, which stands for AI-driven enterprise, is something like Lovable. So I don't know if you've seen this, but obviously you've used different AI tools, whether it's Gemini or ChatGPT or OpenClaw. But Lovable is an AI tool that's used for building applications or websites. And again, like many of the AI tools you use, you essentially type in the specification and it starts to build it for you. And in a couple of minutes, you might have a prototype app or website that you can then start to deploy. And they themselves, I suppose, are a product of AI because they've used AI to build their own systems as well. So it's a bit like, dogs eating the dog food, I suppose, in terms of how they've done this. But what you can imagine is because AI tools are so much more low cost, then you're going to burn through a lot less innovation and product development costs, and you're also going to hit the market a lot more quickly. And arguably, you might, go exponential as in the curve here a lot earlier than you might otherwise have done. So just an interesting shift in terms of the past 3 or 4 years in terms of how quickly you can create an innovation-driven enterprise using AI technologies. Now, of course, it's not just tech companies that have been impacted by AI, but we know, of course, in terms of the impact of AI on jobs, whether it's tech jobs or sales jobs or design jobs, that basically is just reducing the amount of time that it takes for us to do things. Perhaps either making the employees you have more efficient, or in some companies reducing the need for certain types of employees. So we've seen obviously impact in terms of jobs creation and so on. But it's just interesting to see the shift that AI is having on innovation-driven enterprises. They could be the tech companies, as we've mentioned, which typically would have a kind of a more fast time to deployment and ramping up. Then obviously, there's certain types of industries that take more effort and probably take more capital. So if you look at the different curves here, digital enterprise would need a certain amount, a deep tech enterprise probably more, med tech more again, and so on and so on. But for all of those industries, AI has shifted them all in terms of time and also reduced the amount of capital that each requires. So this is a great graphic illustrating that from a guy called Paul Cheek, who has developed a framework called Startup Tactics, and his focus is on the area of AI-driven enterprises. Now, the other interesting thing is that there are obviously certain types of SMEs that are exporters. So they're not just producing products that are limited to a certain locale or a certain region. They are actually exporting products globally. And while they mightn't have the same exponential growth as an innovation-driven enterprise, they are still, there's a curve here, you can see here in this SME exporter, the second from the bottom curve there. So AI also has an impact on not only on innovation-driven enterprises, but also on AI, on exporting SMEs. And again, this can help them to essentially bend the curve and increase their chances of revenue and productivity and obviously job creation as a result through the use of AI tools. So it's essentially, as I say, bending the vector of growth for not just IDEs, but also for SMEs and SME exporters as well. Now, arguably, you could say as well, the SME can benefit from AI tools in terms of all of the activities that they are doing, from bookkeeping to design and graphics and so on, and there will be a slight bend in the curve there as well. So I mentioned Paul Cheek and this concept of startup tactics, and I'll just reference his methodology here. I showed you the 24 steps earlier on, but startup tactics is a follow-on to the disciplined entrepreneurship 24 steps I mentioned in the beginning. And essentially the idea here is you've developed your business plan, whether you use the disciplined entrepreneurship or business model canvas or whatever technique you use to do that. What do you now do? How do you build your business? What are the tactics that will allow you to get going? And what are the steps you need to take? So it's very much experiment driven in terms of, okay, I know who my customer is and I know how I'm supposed to get them, but how do I create my advertising campaign? How do I define my goals? How do I choose what systems I want to use? How do I get outbound sales working? All of those different aspects that you need to make your business. How do you fulfill them? And the idea here is essentially a lot of companies, you've got a founder-led approach because you don't have the resources when you're starting up a startup to begin with. You can't pay for your own lawyer. You can't pay for your own designer or maybe a full sales team. But you can learn enough to get going and learn enough to actually be competent in the different areas the startup needs. And that's the whole idea of startup tactics, and basically giving yourself the skills and allowing you to define experiments or goals for each of these different areas that you need to develop a certain level of competency in to actually get traction and to build your business. So if the 24 steps is around the business plan, startup tactics is around the tactics to build your business. Now, the last thing I'll just talk about for a few minutes is in relation to something I think is interesting for Construct Innovate and for related sectors, and certainly for Wayne and Robbie later on. I think there's going to be a tie-in to the areas they'll be talking about. And that's the area of climate and energy ventures. So, while a lot of focus is on AI companies and, let's say automation or robotics or self-driving, whatever, there's also a huge need, as you know, for more in the climate and energy space. Now, there are challenges here because unlike the innovation-driven enterprise we saw earlier on, a climate and energy venture will take and require a lot more investment, a lot more money, and time to reach scale. So obviously there might be an impact in terms of AI that's going to push it back a little bit, but you can see here just a kind of a sample graph of what this could look like in terms of double the amount of time to get going and much more in terms of the capital required. However, the benefits on the other side are enormous in terms of the markets for the products that we require to benefit both ourselves and the planet as a whole. So this is a new methodology that's been developed, building on the previous ones, and it's called disciplined entrepreneurship for climate and energy ventures. And I suppose the idea here is, to build an app, it's kind of low stakes gambling. You spend a certain small amount of money, you create your app, you get some traction. Building a climate or an energy venture is a lot more challenging. There's a lot more pitfalls along the way, as you can see here on the right hand side, in terms of getting past your prototypes, your pilot, and so on to eventual success. But as I mentioned, if you can get there, the rewards are huge. And I think again for construction, there's a lot of potential in terms of thinking about your project, thinking about your startup from the perspective of climate and energy. And if there are aspects of that are related to your business, then I'd recommend having a look at this new methodology. We had the lead author from this book, Disciplined Entrepreneurship for Climate and Energy Ventures here in Galway a few weeks ago, and he was presenting this framework. And again, it's a certain set of steps you go through. Again, it doesn't have to be, I say, this kind of innate entrepreneurial spirit that somebody has. You can actually develop the skills to go along with that spirit and step you through a structured process to work towards your venture. And you can see some of those steps here. Okay, so that's pretty much what I want to talk about today. But again, very happy to talk about any of these topics in more detail, and I will pass on back to Jamie if there's any questions, or to the next speaker. Thanks again.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. That's fantastic. They're going through the innovation-driven enterprise and discipline entrepreneurship in there, and those models and that, and how AI has its impact on those. So I can see questions already coming in. So if anyone has questions, then please do post them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen there. You'll see the Q&A function. So with that, then I'm going to pass on to our next speaker. So as I said, we'll deal with all the questions at the very end in there. So I'm going to pass over to our next speaker, who's Byrne, who's Water and Climate Tech Board Chair and Founder Director of Method Capital Limited, and he's going to walk us through from idea to exit. So over to you, Wayne.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all, and thanks for that talk, John. Really utilize your adverts product on a week-to-week basis to clear my useless items out of the house, and it works very effectively. So well done to you. I suppose when I was asked to kind of talk to you guys, I suppose I was trying to contextualize for the audience, and I suppose largely speaking, my experiences kind of do fall into kind of infrastructure, I suppose, small to medium size. But definitely, I'm not bringing a kind of a neat story that you can tie up in a bow tie and get on with it. It's a lot messier than that. And what I've learned, I suppose, has come from mostly from things not working or nearly not working. And I suppose I just wanted to kind of share my experiences through the last probably predominantly 20 years, where I've had the benefit of some luck and success around exiting founder-led ventures, with the most recent exit being a company I built up through a spin out from UCD, and was acquired by DuPont at the end of 2019 through a complete acquisition. These days, I mostly wear a kind of a combination hat. I'm a pretty fractionalized person. So I'm a founder, run a kind of a debt advisory firm called Method Capital. I also spend a bit of time in the capital stack, so I work with probably the world's most, I suppose, aggressive water investment firm, which is a company called Burnt Ventures, based out of New York. We've about 40 companies in our portfolio over the last 4 years now, and I wear a number of non-exec and chair role hats across ventures from Saudi Arabia to Seattle. So that's a bit about my background. So I suppose maybe just contextualize against kind of the reality of innovation. I suppose, innovation doesn't necessarily equate to invention. I mean, invention is part of it, but I would say that most innovation typically fails not because the technology doesn't work. It fails because there's no real customer pain. And I suppose the other element is, there's no viable commercial model, or maybe there's no path to scaling the technology. So, I mean, my main takeaway would be that technology in itself isn't enough. It's market understanding the market is definitely a protracted process, and I suppose you need to be mindful of the capital, which buys you the time and the resources. The capital will always demand that you have a plan. So if I was to kind of bring those together, I would say it's important that you don't overinvest in what you can control, which is typically the technology, and you don't underinvest in what determines success, which is typically adoption and scale. So they're kind of critical takeaways, I suppose, to share. Maybe just talking a little bit about my last exit experience, which is Oxymem. This was a company that started at laboratory scale, and was certainly a deep tech classification. I think the initial work started back in 1998. Professor Owen Casey did his PhD, and a lot of the kind of the foundational work was created then. And over the course of the next 10, 12 years, he brought that to a point where Enterprise Ireland felt that it had, potential for commercial engagement. And through the Business Partners Program, I was introduced to Owen, and I worked with him and the research team for about 2 years until we brought it to a point where we felt we could spin it out. And in 2013, we took the technology to out into a special purpose vehicle, which we began with business angel funding and ultimately venture backed it with funding from Dow, from Saudi Aramco, and ultimately DuPont through their merger with Dow. But it took us probably 5 years to achieve product market fit, and that was kind of proving that the product would perform in the marketplace and achieve kind of the energy promises of reduced energy consumption, process intensification, which was basically doing an awful lot more in a much smaller footprint, and achieving a de-risked install, which was effectively a drop-in solution, which we created over the first kind of 2-3 years of scale up. But building out those kind of reference sites was key to kind of ultimately de-risking adoption and the installation process, and evidencing customer traction and that our unit economics were sound. And I would say that all of that ultimately culminated in an exit to DuPont, which I wouldn't classify as a turning point. It was more a kind of a validation of the work we started with them based on their last investment in 2016. And it basically worked because it wasn't just that it was a great technology, but there was clear synergies within the the value chain for DuPont, and there was particular strategic relevance to that acquirer. So they only ever acquired a company that was either number one or number two in the marketplace. And we fell into a number two category just behind General Electric, who had come to the market with a reasonably similar product. And so that effectively culminated in I suppose, meeting a set of KPIs that we agreed back in 2016. And we had either met or achieved those KPIs. They had an option agreement to buy us by December 20th, I think it was, 2019. And I think they ultimately acquired us on the 17th of December 2019. So it was fairly close to the wire. But I would say that, exits don't happen because you want them to. They happen because they become strategically unavoidable, and the synergies and ultimately we're strong enough to make that outcome occur. I would say that, maybe some hard-earned truths that I could share with you. I would say commercialization is a contact sport. You must be in the market constantly, and there comes a point where you can't learn anymore in the lab, and you've got to have those uncomfortable conversations with customers. Learn from messy pilots, first installations. That's where innovation will continue. Speed's important, but it's direction that matters. So don't confuse activity with progress. Going too fast in the wrong direction will just get you lost quicker. Ultimately remember what you're selling. You're selling risk reduction, not technology. So especially in infrastructure. So customers don't really want to buy innovation. They want to buy certainty. And I would say that persistence beats brilliance. These are typically long sales cycles. There's a lot of rejection, and I would say a lot of people fail not because they're wrong, but because they give up or they stop. But equally, I suppose the kind of the other side of that coin is that knowing when to pivot versus persisting is probably the difference is data. That the data is the difference between kind of delusion and vision. And so, measure everything, because without measuring it, you can't manage it. And just maybe final thought on this slide is that, your job is ultimately to prove product market fit, proof that it works in the field, proof that, adoption is occurring and you're getting customer traction. The buyer is willing to bet their reputation on buying your product, and, proving it will scale, can it be repeatedly deployed, especially with capital. And then maybe some closing thoughts. I would say that if you're I suppose going to start a business, with that's innovation led, get a real customer as soon as possible. I think it's absolutely critical that you engage. That will allow you to build reference projects early. I would say where possible, focus on one beachhead market. I've seen certainly strong arguments made for multiple, or certainly two, but the best ones usually have one beachhead market, and I think that's something to think about. Be honest with yourself and with your customers about what is actually risky. And maybe final view is surround yourself with people who've done this before. I know there's some great roadmaps out there. I know there's certainly some great advice that you can get, but having a co-pilot, so to speak, with you, could be a board advisor, or could be someone on the foundation team, but just some experience will also help you with your capital raise. So leverage your network and see who you know. Thank you very much, and thanks for your time, guys.
Now, Wayne, thanks a lot. That's great insights there from idea to exit, and yeah, technology risk is rarely the killer. It's commercial and getting that alignment right between technology, capital, and the market. Um, I like the saying there, like that exit don't happen because you want them. It's when you're strategically unavoidable and getting yourself and getting your product into that position in there. And I suppose that would kind of lead us nice into the last talk was from Robbie Cousins that you might, how do you know that you're strategically unavoidable? Well, you have to get out there, let people know about it and so on in there. So Robbie is our third presenter, and he's the editor of the Irish Construction News and Building Service Engineering, and he's going to talk to us about a perfect pitch, the do's and don'ts of press releases. So when we're at that stage and we're ready to get it out there and get people to notice us in there, he's going to help us to do that. So over to you, Robbie.
Thanks, Jamie. Just checking that is my screen showing up there properly?
Yeah, just hit the presentation button at the very bottom of the screen. So near the bottom right. So you have there's at the very bottom right of your screen. Or if you go to slideshow, go to slideshow at the top. The top ribbon that says slideshow, and then there's our presenter mode or something like that. Oh. No, let me see. Now we're seeing the wrong version there. Try click this use slideshow there. Perfect.
No, that's better. Yeah.
Continue to share. Yeah.
Great.
Ideal. Yeah. Thanks, Robbie.
Okay, have to follow the two guys there. Hi, I'm Robbie Cousins anyhow, and I've kind of 25 years plus experience of working in and around the construction industry. From the late 90s, I would have worked in various publications over the years and as an independent writer, as well as developing websites and working with contractors to, I suppose, help them with their communications packages. Currently, I'm editing two publications. One is Irish Construction News, which we established in 2020, so it's relatively new on the market. It's developed it's I suppose as a magazine for main contractors, suppliers in the construction industry, and local authorities and government bodies that would be involved in construction in the construction area. We work very closely with groups like Construct Innovate, the Irish Green Building Council, and our focus is on sustainability and innovation. And to some degree, in recent times, we're kind of moving into the area of where AI can benefit construction. So our other publication is Building Services Engineering. This is a publication with 60 plus 65 years this year in operation. We took over publication of it last year when the previous editor retired, and so we've been publishing it since the start of last year. This again is for people operating specifically within the building services engineering sector, but it's quite broad because we're talking about, in addition to that, data centers, the development of district heating and other emerging areas of infrastructure over the coming years. With both of these publications, they both have their own website, constructionnews.ie and buildingservicesengineering.ie, and we put out a monthly newsletter of news from both sectors of the construction industry, where I try to highlight kind of key innovations that are coming through the sector. So my presentation is really looking at it's kind of a crash course in what I've experienced in terms of the information and how people present information to me. And while it might say how not to annoy editors, it's really just to make your job easier to get your message across in as tight a way as possible. So really, it's perfecting your pitch. It's a short guide to the do's and don'ts of press releasing. And the first thing is to get your pitch right. I suppose, that you're sitting down to write something that you know who you're sending it to. There aren't that many publications that are in this field, but then again, you may be looking to do something on a local area, or you may also be looking to do something on the national stage. But you need to just keep your pitch short and go to the who, what, where, when, and why of it, stating clearly. And then you need to have a good quote, maybe from a key individual within the organization, and clearly defining who they are, what their role is in the organization, and again, the name of the organization, just to get that across. It's always helpful to offer additional information and key people within the organization that would be available for issue or for interview or further discussion on the issue that's being promoted. And just remember, look, it's a straightforward thing, a press release. It's not an advertisement. That just keep it simple and focus on the key issue that you're trying to get across. I suppose, the problem that arises most for when stuff is coming in, and particularly in recent years, is the use of imagery. A lot of the press releases that I would get in, they either don't have imagery with it, or they have low-res images that have been pulled off a website, which can't be used for print purposes. There's sometimes maybe issues around the rights on those images as well. But if you try and originate your own images at least a resolution of 1 MB or 300 dpi, and of your clear picture of your product or your team. And if you are organizing events or stuff like that, or attending an event, and an opportunity comes up to get professional pictures taken, or if you are booking in someone to do professional pictures, always make sure, if there are people within your organization that would be potential to be interviewed, to get clear profile shots of them that can be sent in, and just to include those. It is you constantly going back to people, asking them for better images than what might have come through. Obviously, then the further on we use we put stuff out through our website and through our newsletters and that. So it's always handy to have drone footage, product demos, that type of thing, and YouTube or Vimeo links that we can incorporate into presentations. And QR codes, just to go back as well, if you are writing, just to go back and if there is further information to be got from a website, send a QR code with the press release, just to give people, I suppose, an opportunity to come to you. And then finally, just on the image front, make sure that you're captioning your images clearly. Again, the name of the person, the name of the site, or the name of the product, with a clear description of what it is. Going back to the person as well, is what is their role within the organization, and what is the organization they're in. Just as well, images are getting bigger, so if you're sharing videos or a number of images of, say, shots of a project, use web sharing platforms such as WeTransfer, Dropbox, etc. And again, use particularly when you're sharing high-res images. Just things to avoid. Again, this happens occasionally. If you've done up a press release and you decide, look, I'm going to try and present this in as best a format as possible, so I'll lay it out for the publication. So, and then you end up designing a PDF and sending it in as a PDF. PDFs are notoriously difficult to edit, because when you extract the text from them, it loses formatting, all that type of thing. And then the images that are embedded are generally of too low resolution to use. Again, back to that thing, please don't send thumbnail images. They pixelate when you blow them up on the pages. Keep your press releases simple. Don't send in a very long wall of text. If you are sending in a lot of text, try and break up that text with subheadings so it can be scanned easily, and that the person knows exactly what you're trying to say. Avoid jargon in as much as you can. If we're expanding an article, we will come back to you and incorporate some level of technical language into it. That would be, but remember that the person that you're hoping will read this, that you're speaking to a broad market outside of your place. And then just be careful of the AI traps. While AI is helpful, make sure if you have used an AI tool to put together a release or put together a document that you proof it carefully to make sure that it says what you want to say and that it hasn't decided to go off on a run on its own. Avoid bland language, and then just for me anyhow, just in so much as possible, mind your Z's and Z's. Go through it just to check that there's appropriate spelling for that it's English rather than US spelling, and then just in terms of dealing with editors, it's always good to build a rapport with magazine editors where possible. But yeah, just gently follow up. Don't be ringing constantly. A lot of stuff does come in through our inboxes, and some of it can get lost. So it is useful for you to follow up and to talk to the editor. But leave it at that, and if you have built up a rapport with them, you'll know yourself what's a surefire way to actually build on that relationship. Beyond the magazine. So again, this is your social media. So if you are posting stuff, make use of groups. Set your page up, your LinkedIn page up properly to post your news. So if you have written a press release, also sort of use social media such as LinkedIn to put it up there. You'll have your imagery together for that and video links and that you can put up there. And then don't just be broadcasting. Make sure that if you are engaging within that kind of group of people that you want to speak with, that you're raising your profile within those groups. Again, LinkedIn itself is useful if you're on the talent search area, that to show the corporate culture within your organization, to show what it's like to work within your organization. There's always opportunities there, particularly around, say, earlier this month, like women in construction, to present press releases about achievements of women in your organization, or just to look at diversity within your organization and that type of thing. And then if you are posting within LinkedIn, always, if you're promoting a project, always acknowledge those who've contributed to achievements within that project. So be they people within your team, your clients, architects, main contractors, suppliers, etc., just to make sure that just to give a better spread in terms of reach and that. And then obviously, if you do get something published in Irish Construction News or Building Services Engineering, we're happy to share PDFs with you and share the links to those publications if you want to put those out on your social media platforms. Just to finish up, I will include this as an extract back to in PDF form, but it will be. This is a standard structure for a press release, just to follow, like a template to follow in devising up your press release based on the stuff that I've just presented here. And that will be, I think that's been shared with everybody after the presentations. And then, like, that's just the document, a sample press release that you can use as a follow-up in terms of how to put together your piece. And that's really it. If you want to get in touch with me or test out your press release and that, feel free to write to me there or to connect with me on LinkedIn. Both publications, the newsletters are free, so you can just go onto the websites and register to get the newsletter, or drop me a note if you want to get a physical version of the magazine. I'd be quite happy to follow through on that with you. And that's really me. Thanks a million.
Yeah, Robbie, that's very helpful, and nice to get that template. And as I said, just share around those slides afterwards to people that attended. So with that, we're going to open up for the Q&A session. So thank you very much to our three presenters. So if the three presenters want to turn on your cameras and your